Welcome again as we continue in our special edition of Grafted In and talk about the events in the Middle East that are taking place as we move into the fall and we move into the dramatic events as the Palestinian Authority seeks to unilaterally have themselves declared a state. Our last broadcast, we were talking about the independence of Israel. And Donna, you remember we talked about how as that infant nation pronounced itself according to, by the way, the laws of the United Nations, the laws of the League of Nations, every legal right that exists among the nations of planet Earth, Israel had every right to be a state.
That's right.
That was proclaimed in the Balfour Declaration. It was carried forth in the resolution at San Remo. It was ratified by the League of Nations. It was, in fact, ratified by the United Nations. The British Mandate, which, by the way, was the land that created Jordan, created Israel. Out of the mandate system came Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. All those Middle East nations, if Israel doesn't have a right to exist, none of them have a right to exist, because it all comes out of the same foundation. And people aren't being taught that in their history classes, but you need to understand the whole Middle East came out of the British and French mandates and were divided into nation states. And in fact, the British were charged with taking their mandate and creating a homeland for the Jews. We talked about in previous weeks how the British unilaterally decided to take 3/4 of that land and create the nation we now know as Jordan. They, by the way, didn't have a legal right to do that, but they went ahead and did it anyway. I've had people say to me, well, you know, the British promised the Arabs they could have a land. Well, they got a land.
That's right.
They didn't have a treaty, but they gave them a land anyway. They gave them the land of Jordan. Should the Palestinians have a state? Well, guess what? The Palestinians already have a state. It is called Jordan. And that was created for the Arabs. And
out of the land that was supposed to go to Israel.
Out of the land that was originally supposed to go to Israel.
So Israel really has already given up.
They've already given up land. They gave up tremendous land to create Transjordan, which became Jordan. That's where the Palestinians, that should be their homeland. By the way, the Jordanians don't want them there. It's Arabs not wanting Arab that created the whole problem. Right. So we talked about the fact that when Israel declared itself a nation in 1948, immediately Egypt and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, all the nations around attacked this infant nation.
And when you say immediately, it really was literally immediately.
Oh, absolutely.
It was immediately.
Even though the nations of the world said Israel has a right to exist, the surrounding Arabs nations would not accept it, even though they were created, by the way, even though they were created by the nations of the world.
That's right.
And they attacked with the intent of destroying every Jew and destroying that infant state.
That's right.
Nothing has changed since 1948. Nothing in the Middle East has changed. The nations of the world said Israel has a right to exist in their God-given homeland.
That's right.
And since 1948, nothing has changed. Oh, the tactics have changed. How they go about it has changed. Now the Palestinians want to go and unilaterally declare a state. But by the way, in their charter is the destruction of the nation of Israel. The Arab nations never have, and to this point, never will accept the fact that the nations of the world said Israel has a right to the land. And more importantly, God says they have a right.
That's right.
Well, that war of independence ended on 15 July 1949 with Israel now having 8,000 square miles of land. Now think about that. In the light of all the Arab nations around, 8,000 puny little miles.
That's right. Compared to that large mass that they were supposed to have.
And compared to the whole Arab world that covers all of North Africa, all the rest of the Middle East. What is it about the Muslims that they do not want to accept the Jews in their own land? What is it about Islam that says, no, we want to kill every Jew, and we don't want them to have even a piece of what was their God-given homeland? It's absolutely amazing, and the world just seems to get caught up in things. Well, let's talk about their life as a nation. You know, our nation was birthed in a war.
Yes, it was.
And it was a war of independence. In our case, it was a war to become independent from Britain.
That's right.
Israel's case, it was a war to defend their right to exist as a nation.
Yes.
But our nation, once peace was declared, began to have a measure of peace. It wasn't until the War of 1812 that we had another war to fight. Whereas Israel, after the armistice was signed, continued to have border attacks,
that's right.
artillery bombardment.
Always. They've
Now-
lived with that always.
Now, Donna, you've been to the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. In fact, we were just there. We stayed at a kibbutz there. You remember
That's
that?
right. Yes, I do.
Tell us a little bit about how narrow that is there.
Well, I'm going to tell you, as the crow flies, is a very, very small distance. I think that anybody who is suggesting that they give up the Golan needs to go there. Anybody that has any sense, and stand up on those Golan Heights and look over and see how any sane person could expect a nation to give up this strategic point of their land, because the enemy can just come and settle right up on the top of it and look down and shoot right into them.
When you say look down, how rapidly does the Golan Heights rise from the Sea of Galilee?
It just goes right up there.
It's straight.
That's straight right up there.
It's not a gradual, let's drive up
it's
the
not.
road.
That's right. No, it's just straight right up there. And it's a strategic point that they need for their defense. Israel needs for their defense.
So in those first years, imagine that, a strip of land on the east side of the Sea of Galilee was maybe half a mile from the edge of the sea to the steep rising mountains.
Right. Yep.
And the Syrians had artillery shells on those mountaintops.
That's right.
And they would fire down onto the kibbutzes
That's right.
of the Israelis trying to farm that little strip of land.
That's right.
Continuous border attacks
That's right.
have always been a part of Israel's
That's right.
existence.
That's right.
Now, the border on the south, after the war, the Sinai Peninsula, that whole area around Gaza, that the United Nations established peacekeepers between Israel on the south and then the Egyptians in the Sinai. This is, by the way, why I'm not particularly keen about United Nations peacekeepers. What happened on May 19th, 1967, was Egypt expelled the United Nations peacekeepers. Now, wait a minute. Here's Israel. Here's Egypt. We have a war. By the way, it was not the Israelis who said, let's stop the war. It was all their enemies who said, we're being defeated, we better stop the war.
That's right.
Who cried out to the United Nations, help the Israelis, big bad Israelis are beating us up. Excuse me.
Who started the war?
Who started it? And by the way, you outnumbered them 20-1.
That's right.
And so the United Nations troops, as part of the ceasefire, were established along that line between Israel and Egypt, but on the Egyptian side of the border. And on May 19th, the Egyptians kicked them out. Now, the present-day Palestinians say they want a state. By the way, they want the United Nations to come into that state to protect their rights, and they want the United States to be in charge of the United Nations in that new Palestinian state. But we have a long history of Arabs attacking Israel, getting defeated, crying out to the United Nations, oh, they're beating us up, even though they started the war.
They started it.
Asking for the UN to form a protection between the two nations. While that United Nations is in there, the Arabs rearm and get themselves equipped.
And now kick the peacekeepers.
And now kick out the peacekeepers.
Now we think we've got a chance to come back and fight and win.
Right.
So now we don't need you and
So
we'll get out.
why would we think it's going to be any different this time? Excuse me. Anyway, so that was followed by May 22nd, 3 days later. In 1967, Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran. Now, the Straits of Tiran is the seaway down at the bottom of Israel. If you go down to where the Red Sea is, that's called the Straits of Tiran. And Egypt closed the straits. They blockaded it. Now, by any international law of this world,
That's right.
if you blockade another nation, that is an act of war.
It's an act of war.
It's an act of war. You don't have to send a letter. You don't have to get on the radio and say, we declare war.
No.
If you blockade another nation, by all international law,
It's recognized
that is a declaration
That's right.
of war.
That's right.
So when people ask when did the 67 war begin, I maintain that it began on May 22nd, 1967, when Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran. From that moment, Israel had a right to begin to bomb Egypt,
right.
to take out any of their military, because war had been declared.
That's right.
But they didn't, because why? They hoped for peace. They're always
hoping
they're
for
the
peace.
ones always hoping for
That's right.
peace.
They're the
Again,
only peace partners that have ever come and sat at the table.
every single war, Israel has bent over backwards to
That's
try
right.
to stop the war, to get the war prevented. And in this case, even though they've been blockaded and could have declared war. I mean, we, the United States, if we were
And
blockaded.
they would have good reason. That would have been a good reason for them to declare
Absolutely.
war.
The next step was, while they were waiting, the armies massed at Israel's borders. In other words, from the north, the Syrian armies came down right to the border. From the Jordanian armies were already there. And the Egyptian armies came right up to the border. You're looking at maybe 80,000 to 100,000 troops massed on your border. You know, Don, I played a game years ago with my children called War. And in war, you kind of mass your armies, because if I decide to attack your country, I got to have more than you do.
That's right.
And so as you're playing the game, you know, you try to kind of secretively begin to move troops into a place. But, you know, when you see your opponent moving all his armies into a place, you know that's where he's going to
That's
try
right.
to
He's
attack.
going to plan to
You know
attack
what he's
you.
got in mind.
Yes.
And so the armies were massed on Israel's border. The Arab leaders began to call publicly, right out on the radio waves,
They never have kept it hidden. They've
for the
always been pretty
total
publicly saying it.
destruction
That's right.
of Israel. Now, let's pause and think. These Arab nations are supposedly members of the United Nations. The United Nations Charter forbids one nation from calling for the destruction of another nation.
That's right. Rightfully so.
In other words, we're a club, and to be part of this club, you cannot threaten to kill another member of the club.
That's right. That's right.
And I hear that you threatened to kill George, and so I simply say, is that true? Yes, I'm going to kill George. Well, then
you're
you
out of the
can't
club.
be a member
That's right.
of the club.
That's right.
The minute you don't do that, the club is useless.
That's right. The rules
are useless.
The rules are useless.
So in 1967, when the Arab leaders called publicly for the total destruction of another member of the United Nations,
That's right.
the United Nations at that point should have either
Should have.
cast them out of the United Nations,
That's right.
or simply said, well, we're just a group and we never mean what we say. And that's exactly why some people call them the useless nations.
That's right.
And see, we as the United States should have said, if you don't kick them out, we don't play. I am not going to be part of a group of people who make a rule and won't enforce it.
That's right.
Okay? But they called for it. And in fact, let's look at some of these. Egyptian radio, Voice of the Arabs, 18th May, 1967. This is a quote. Donna, why don't you read that for us?
They said, the sole method we will apply against Israel is total war, which will result in the extermination of Zionist existence. That's quite clear.
I think that's quite
Their
clear.
intent was quite clear.
So if Russia were to say the sole method we're going to apply against the United States is total war, and it's going to result in the extermination of the United States, do we just kind of say, well, let's see if we can talk? Listen to this. Syrian Defense Minister Hafez al-Assad, 20 May, 2 days later, 1967, listen to what he said. Go ahead.
He said, I, as a military man, believe that the time has come to enter into a battle of annihilation.
A battle of annihilation. Folks, come on.
Those words are quite clear.
This is clear. This is not...
You really can't misunderstand their intent.
We are going to enter into a war to annihilate you. This is barbarism. This is insanity. This is worse than Hitler. This is worse than Stalin. It is of the same ilk. It is, we are going to annihilate Israel.
That's right.
Listen to what Egyptian President Nasser said on the 26th of May.
He said, "We intend to open a general assault against Israel. This will be total war. Our basic aim will be to destroy Israel."
These are quotes, my friends. These
That's
are
right.
quotes.
That are
This
on
is
record.
exactly what they said they were going to do in 1967.
That's right.
When people criticize Israel, I say to you, you don't know what you're
That's right.
talking about.
That's right.
You're ignorant. Look at the facts. The facts are Israel, a tiny nation of 8,000 square miles, surrounded by nations who are saying, we're going to annihilate you. We're going to kill every single Jew.
That's right.
That is a moral war that requires that we respond to it. And finally, Iraqi President Aref on the 31st of May said this.
"The existence of Israel is an error which must be rectified. Our goal is clear: to wipe Israel off the map."
So my question, those four statements, Donna, does this sound like statements today that are being made in the mosques of
Yes, it
Arab
is.
countries?
They haven't changed their wording. They haven't changed their intent. This is what they still intend on doing. It hasn't changed. Like you said, things have not changed since the inception of their birth. I mean, it's the same thing. And they're making their goal quite clear.
60 some years after the War of Independence, after Israel was a state, 60 years later, the mosques of the Arab countries
Are saying the same
are
thing.
saying the exact same thing.
That's right.
The hatred being preached in the schools of the Arab countries is the same.
That's right.
Their goal is to annihilate the Jews.
That's right.
If you can't read Holocaust in that, you are dumb and ignorant.
Yep.
That's exactly the goal of the Arab nations.
And the people.
And people in this country run around saying, oh, the poor Palestinians have their rights. Give me a break. The Palestinians have a country to live in.
That's right.
And no amount of oppression, and by the way, the oppression does not exist.
No, it
Arabs in Israel have far more freedom than Arabs in anywhere, including the Palestinian Authority.
They prefer to live there
Right.
because they
Arabs
thrive better
in
there.
Israel have more freedom than Arabs in Gaza. Give me a break, these persecuted people. You Christians that go around saying, oh, we support those poor Palestinians, you don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
This is a culture that for 60 years has vowed to annihilate the Jews, and every person with a moral fiber must stand up and say, never on my watch will that happen. And when we have a government that says we need to help the Palestinians, we have an immoral government. It's not moral. Do you realize, Donna, that over half of the budget of the Palestinian Authority is being paid by United States taxpayer dollars?
That's right.
Do you know?
And these people that we're paying this money to have also vowed that once they're done with Israel, they're coming after us.
That's right.
And so we're paying for them to progress to wipe us out.
Do you know that the Palestinian Authority pays its terrorists who are in jail in Israel? Mm-hmm. If you're a minor terrorist, you got arrested, you got caught with a bomb, and you're in jail in Israel, the Palestinian Authority government pays your family back in the PA. They pay them, I think it's somewhere around $1,000 a month. Mm-hmm. If you're a mastermind terrorist who got caught and you're in Israeli jail, they pay you $3,000 a month. Where's that money coming from for them to pay terrorists in jails? Right. It's coming out of your taxpayer dollars. We're supporting the wrong side in this. So back in 1967, they vowed to totally annihilate Israel.
Annihilate it. Very clearly they made their statements.
You know, it's interesting. When God shows up for a people, then the world gets mad at God and his people rather than what he's doing. Let me tell you what happened. Here you are, you're the nation of Israel. You're surrounded by Egypt, massed their armies, they're ready to go, and they're saying, we're coming and we're going to annihilate you. The Jordanians are over there, they're going to annihilate you. You got the Lebanese and the Syrian coming down from the north across the Golan. Everybody in the military world in this state in the United States looking at that said, Israel's going to be hard-pressed to survive.
That's right.
The Israelis were planning over 5,000 or 6,000 body bags immediately to bury people. And so on June 5th, Israel launched a preemptive attack to defend herself.
That's right.
Now, I've heard people say Israel started the war on June 5th. And again, I say to you, you're ignorant.
That's right.
You're absolutely ignorant. You don't understand a thing about warfare. You don't understand anything about legalities. And you don't understand a thing about what was going on. Wait a minute. You're surrounded, come on, you're surrounded by all these people who are threatening to kill you. So you launch a preemptive attack and you're the one that started it? If I'm down in the streets of Fitchburg and people are threatening to kill me, so I call the police, and the police go, and before that person can hit me, they arrest him because he made attack. Is that called I started the problem? I don't think so. They're threatening to kill me. I call the police go take him out. Why? Because he started it.
That's right.
The Arabs started the war of 1967.
Yes, they did.
And Israel, to defend herself, said, we're going to start by taking out the entire Egyptian Air Force.
That's right.
Brilliant. This war, by the way, think about it. Egypt had planned for years and years. They'd had, 20 years to plan for this war from the last defeat. The Syrians, they massed all their armies. They have all this weaponry. They have Russian weaponry primarily.
That's right.
And there's little tiny Israel. This war that's going to be total war and going to annihilate Israel lasted only 6 days.
That's right.
The 6-day war. It was a miracle.
Yes, it was.
An absolute miracle. How did Israel do this? It was truly David and Goliath all over again. And in fact, the only reason the war got stopped was because Israel quickly decimated the Air Force, destroyed the Air Force of Egypt. Therefore, they could now, with their airplanes, destroy the armor of the Egyptians, and within a matter of 2 or 3 days, push the entire Egyptian army all the way back across the Gulf of Suez, across the Suez Canal, and in fact, Israel crossed the Suez Canal.
That's right.
Now, people don't understand the politics of those days. All of a sudden, the United States is saying to Israel, we got to stop. We got to stop. You got to stop your ally. But why? Here's Israel. They're across the Suez Canal at the gates of Cairo. Here up on the north, they push the Syrians out of the Golan Heights, and the door to Damascus is wide open. What was the United States concerned about? They were not concerned for Israel. No, they never went in and said, oh, we got to help you win this.
That's right.
They were concerned because Damascus and Cairo were allies of Russia. And their concern was if Israel went into Cairo and went into Damascus, now the Russians are going to get involved, and that's going to mean we, the United States, are now going to be at war with Russia.
Right.
It had nothing to do with Israel.
No, it did not.
It wasn't because we love the Israelis.
No, it was not.
It was simply out of self-interest.
And notice they stepped in when Israel was winning.
That's right.
That's when they came
Well,
in.
and
not
by the
when
way,
they heard
all
the
across that
threats.
front, on 3 fronts, tiny Israel was winning.
That's
6 days, Israel totally destroyed the enemy Air Force, gained the whole of Sinai, gained the Golan Heights. All of Jerusalem was now back in Israeli hands for the first time in 2,000 years since the Romans kicked them out. Now listen, still the Arabs did not sign a definite peace treaty.
No, they didn't.
Now this is important to see, folks, because we have a president who says that Israel should go back to the 1967 border. It was never a border.
No, it wasn't.
Look at the UN resolutions and the result of that war. That the West Bank, so-called, is land that is to be determined by negotiation. There never was a border there.
That's right.
The Arabs did not sign a peace treaty. In other words, literally, the Arabs and the Israelis have been at war for 25 years. There's just an armistice, a truce, but there's no border.
That's right.
You know, there's a border between North and South Korea. There was a war going on. And then there was a truce. And while there was a truce, they were negotiating what is going to be the border.
Right.
And little wars would break up in this period of the truce. Why? Because they were trying to establish the border. But in a matter of 3 to 5 years, the border was established. And no one questions the border
That's right.
between North and South Korea.
That's right.
My question is, how on earth have we gone 40 years and the Arabs have not signed a peace treaty?
That's right.
Because the United Nations has allowed it to be that way.
That's right.
Absolutely amazing. So, that war kind of opened up a door.
That's right.
The whole of what we now know is the West Bank came under the control of Israel.
That's right.
The Golan Heights came under the control of Israel. All of Jerusalem
It was under the
came
control.
under the control of Israel.
And
For-
didn't you say that they had pushed all the way over through, into the
Oh yeah, right. So what happened after that war was pretty amazing. First thing is, Israel unilaterally gave the Sinai back to Egypt. That's unheard of.
That is very
You know, when somebody attacks you and you go and defend yourself and you end up conquering
So
their
that's
land.
where the borders should have been, is wherever they conquered and
Right,
they won.
absolutely.
When we say go back to 1967 borders, let's go back to where they had pushed the troops back to,
That's
the enemy
right.
back to. Those are where the borders are.
That's right.
Legally, according to the declarations of war, the winning party wins this amount, you took this land, there's where the borders are.
That's right.
That's where, so maybe it's a good thing if it goes back to the 1967
That's
borders.
not how they
because,
define
whoa,
it.
look at how wide their thing is going to be.
They define them as pretty.
Right, because they play by different rules.
Right,
They
so-
make them up as they go along.
So what happened, let me give you an example so you understand. After World War II, the Allies took over Germany, and they divided it into partitions. And the Allies controlled it until such a time as they could enable a German government to take place. They didn't turn around the next day and say, we give it back to you, Germany.
No.
Okay? You establish peace, then you might talk about how the land's going to go.
Right.
Israel
Gave
gave
it back.
the whole Sinai back to Egypt. They also gave the Temple Mount back to the control of the Arabs. And Moshe Dayan did that with no vote or anything. He unilaterally told the Waqf, you can have this. What they retained was all of Jerusalem, they retained the Golan Heights, they retained the West Bank, and because Israel had that land in their possession, that land prospered. And we're going to talk about that next week. The result of the 1967 war is that the Arabs prospered like they'd never prospered before. This is Pastor Don and Donna Long. We hope you'll join us next week as we continue in this series from Grafted In, Israel and the Middle East.